Good evening. People could find a seat. We're ready to get going. Welcome to All Saints Church. Welcome to Countering White Supremacy, a forum with Congressman Adam Schiff. My name is Mike Kinman. I am the rector here at All Saints Church. My pronouns are he, him. As we get going this evening, when we started to plan this evening together, we knew that white supremacy was a continuing and growing problem in this country. We did not know that the depth of the problem would be punctuated the way it has been in the last 2 days with the shootings in El Paso and in Dayton. These are situations that again and again have tempted us as individuals and even as communities to despair because they keep happening over and over and over again. And despair is not a value that we share, whatever faith we have that brings us here this evening. And so as we start, instead of the moments of silence that we are rightly having, remembering the victims of this tragedy, I want to invite you, as you are able, to stand. And I invite you to look around this room and look each other in the eye and encounter each other and recognize the power that exists in this room. That each one of us in this room is a person of power, and together that power becomes exponential. And so if we treat this evening like a spectator sport, then it has very little potential to make any difference. But if we recognize that the power to change the narrative of this country exists in this space in ourselves, then this gathering has the power to make all the difference. And so I hope that stays on our hearts. Please be seated. It is a joy to welcome you to All Saints Church. We are a community of radical inclusion, courageous justice, joyful spirituality, and ethical stewardship. We are a community that is committed to the theology and practice of sanctuary when the most vulnerable among us become targets of the state. We have a long history of working with some amazing partners throughout the faith community in Southern California and across the country. And so it was our honor to be approached by those partners to ask to host this event. And I want to recognize and give deep thanks to those partners as we begin. First, ECAR. ECAR is amazing. It is one of the fastest growing and most influential Jewish communities in the country. The Rabbi Sharon Brous is a true prophet. It is an amazing community. Can we give a hand to ECAR, please? Next, the Islamic Center of Southern California, which also is one of the largest mosques in Southern California, is an amazing community of justice, has stood in the good for so many years. Can we give a hand for the Islamic Center of Southern California? And finally, the Muslim Public Affairs Council. This is the primary organization for national American Muslim advocacy and public policy, shaping a new and true narrative for American Muslims in this country. Can we give a hand to MPAC? And very briefly, there's two people I want to single out. The first is Prema Rahman, who is the community government liaison for MPAC. Prema, are you around? You got to be in here somewhere. I know she's around somewhere. She's right there. She has worked so hard putting this together. Prema, you are amazing. Thank you so much. And then finally, I want to introduce our moderator for tonight, Salam Al-Marayati. Salam is the president and co-founder of MPAC. He is one of the leading American voices for improving the public understanding of Islam and political advocacy for American Muslims. Would you please give a huge welcome to Salam Al-Marayati? Thank you.
Thank you very much. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, it's good to be back at my church again. And we want to thank Mike Kinman, the rector of All Saints Church, for his leadership in bringing us together. And as he said, it is really up to the people. This is not an option anymore. It is people that make change. And connecting with our decision makers as a way to create policies that impact all of us and improve those policies so we end the double standards, we end the injustices, and at the very least, we have someone in Washington that listens to the people and represents the people, and that is why we are so honored today to have with us the Honorable Adam Schiff. But that, hold on. That's not his introduction. That's not his introduction. We have to say a lot more than that. I need to work on, developing the spacing of these comments, but I also want to thank our co-sponsors, ICAR, the Islamic Center, All Saints Church, all three great organizations. That's a trinity this Muslim can believe in. Now, on a more serious matter, today is actually the anniversary, the 7-year anniversary of the shooting at the Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, where Wade Michael Page went in and shot brutally, fatally, 6 people and wounded many more. And that was a warning sign. And there was no policy to deal with that issue. And then today, as Rector Mike Kinman told us, just this week, we had the shootings in El Paso and Dayton. And still, we have not gotten the message that this is a serious threat. There is one person, however, that we're counting on to help lead the way in getting our voices heard in Washington. He is a man who stood here. He reminded us 20 years ago, Congressman Adam Schiff was here when the Muslim community was attacked as terrorist sympathizers, and he was with us. He did not waver. He demanded that he represent all the people of his district. He was here when this church was attacked for giving a sermon by George Regas on peacemaking, and this church was attacked as violating tax law. He defended All Saints Church. He's been with people all this time, and we've seen him on television stand up for the truth, stand up for facts, stand up for justice. He is married to a wonderful woman named Eve, and maybe someday we'll have Adam and Eve come to our church. He is a father, he's a brother of many, he's a voice of reason and a voice of the intellect. And with that, I would like to welcome the Honorable Adam Schiff. Sorry, Ann. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that very warm welcome. Thank you, Salam, my friend, my brother, my cousin. It is wonderful to join you again, and to all of my wonderful friends here at All Saints, to George and Mary, how wonderful to see you, and how wonderful to be in your presence. I want to thank Rector Mike Kinman and All Saints, the entire community, for hosting the event tonight. Thank you to the co-sponsors of the event, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, ICAR, and the Islamic Center of Southern California. There's a lot to discuss tonight about how to address the rise of hate and violence, but there's no better antidote to that than love and community, which is represented so well by the gathering here tonight. This audience from diverse faiths and all backgrounds embodies the America that we are fighting for and what makes our community great. I wish this was not such a timely discussion, but after the terrorist attack in El Paso, where a white supremacist killed 22 people and injured many more, there is no escaping the clear and present danger of white supremacist violence in the United States and the terrible urgency to confront it. Simply put, it's domestic terrorism, acts of unspeakable violence motivated by a hateful ideology which justifies them as a means to an end. It shouldn't be hard or controversial to say that. After all, if the shooter in El Paso was Muslim, is there any question how the president would describe him? That is the sad reality of the balkanization of information and beliefs in our country, which we must confront head on. El Paso was among the deadliest domestic terror attacks in recent history, but it is part of a larger trend. According to the Anti-Defamation League, in 2008, 39 of 50 killings committed by political extremists were carried out by white supremacists, and 8 more were carried out by anti-government extremists. For 3 years running, the FBI has charted an increase in hate crimes reported by local law enforcement agencies, with a 17% jump in the most recent statistics from 2017. I'll start with the simplest, most obvious thing to do: pass gun violence reforms to put in place universal background checks, ban assault weapons, and more. Making guns harder to get and less deadly won't stop hate, but it will save lives. In El Paso, in Dayton, in Gilroy, and in 100 other communities whose names have now become synonymous with mass gun violence, first responders responded quickly. But when a shooter can fire 30, 40, or 50 rounds in less than a minute, it will never be fast enough. The damage has already been done, and the lives have already been destroyed. The shooter in Dayton carried a device previously banned under the assault weapons ban that held 120 bullets. There is no reason anyone should be able to own a device other than to kill as many people as possible, as fast as possible, which is exactly what he did. The House of Representatives has already passed 2 major gun reforms to expand background checks and to close the so-called Charleston loophole that allowed the killer, who murdered 9 African-American worshipers at the Emmanuel AME Church, to purchase a gun he should have been barred from obtaining. Those bills are awaiting action in the Senate, and they shouldn't wait any longer. Mitch McConnell must stop blocking action, and he shouldn't wait until September. He should call the Senate back into session this week. These bills won't stop every mass shooting, but they would stop some and make others less deadly, and they would save lives among the thousands who die from shootings, suicide, or accidental shootings every year. There is also an urgent need to finally take white supremacist violence seriously as a systemic issue. White supremacists share a common ideology and language. They have clearly articulated goals, and they congregate and communicate with one another in specific hate forums and channels online, and they recruit heavily from disaffected young people, white men who are searching out related content online. These are not lone wolf attacks or isolated incidents, as we've seen how attacks have motivated other angry, isolated men to put hate into action. Treating El Paso as if it is unrelated to Pittsburgh or Christchurch is a mistake. Indeed, these attacks share much in common with efforts by ISIS to inspire attackers in Western countries to carry out attacks of their own and with little direction. We need a response that is commensurate with the threat. The federal government is beginning to respond, though not fast enough or with the urgency required. The most recent national counterterrorism strategy for the first time made direct reference to domestic terrorism. FBI Director Chris Wray testified last month that the Bureau is conducting 850 active domestic terrorism investigations and made clear that these are a priority. But Congress must act as well. There are a variety of bills in Congress, apart from gun violence legislation, to enhance our efforts against white supremacist violence and to improve data collection for hate crimes, which has lagged for years. In July, the House passed the Intelligence Authorization Act with almost 400 bipartisan votes, a bill that I co-authored. This is the annual authorization for the intelligence community, one of my top priorities as chairman of that committee. I was proud that for the first time the bill prioritizes domestic terrorism, requiring annual reporting and analysis to Congress and the public about domestic terror threats. This is vital because the FBI's own hate crime statistics have shown 3 straight years of increases through 2017, and there's no indication that there is slowing down. Those numbers rely on law enforcement to submit data to the FBI, and whether because they lack the training or the interest to classify crimes motivated by hatred, we know that many hate crimes motivated in the same way as the El Paso shooter go unreported in the national statistics. In the past, I've urged the FBI to improve training offered to local law enforcement, but more needs to be done, and I expect the House to prioritize these issues. We need quality data on hate crimes, and we also need to train local law enforcement to take them seriously. There's also a role for responsible actors in the online space to decide that they don't want to associate and help spread hate. White supremacist ideology and extremism, of course, predates the internet, but with 3 recent domestic attacks with clear links to the online forum called 8chan, we can no longer ignore the role that the internet plays in fomenting extremism. I was pleased that its hosting company parted ways with it this morning. More companies in the tech sphere need to act to ensure that the hate populated on sites like 8chan is not spread. But it shouldn't take a mass shooting to spur action. Here's what should happen. Responsible companies can decide not to do business or provide hosting services with sites like this one. And companies like Google can do more to keep extremism off their sites and not point users to it through their algorithms. But we must confront the ugly truth, and that is that in his statements and actions, President Trump has given succor to extremists, white nationalists, and racists. He has called white nationalists at the Charlottesville rally very fine people. He attacks immigrants in dehumanizing rhetoric as invaders or an infestation, language echoed by the killer in El Paso. He has called for and implemented a bigoted Muslim ban. Condemnations of white supremacist ideology ring hollow when they are bookended by tweets using the same language that the white supremacists use. I don't expect Trump to change. It's up to us to mobilize and organize and demand better. Leaders from both parties need to step up. America's diversity is our greatest strength, not something to be feared, and we will confine hateful, racist ideologies to where they belong, the dustbin of history. We must stand together as Americans. Nothing will bring back the victims in El Paso or other hate crimes, but we can and must defeat the ideology that took their lives. I'm proud to join you tonight. I'm proud to stand with the faith leaders who are here tonight, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman, for elucidating not only the challenges facing us, but the path towards resolution. And we really appreciate those words. We are now joined on this panel by Brooke Wirtschafter, who is the ECAR Director of Community Organizing, and Mr. Andre Henry, who is a writer, speaker, and musician with a deep passion for racial justice and social change, and he's lectured at many universities. So we're going to get right into this and have a conversation, and then there will be people coming down the aisle to take your questions, and we'll bring them up, and we'll have a conversation here. And after this panel conversation, we'll have a second panel conversation with a person who actually testified to the Congress, who's the chairman of the Islamic Center of Southern California, and also a reserve LAPD officer, along with Susan Russell here at All Saints Church. So we wanted to start the conversation, though, here with the congressman. And one of the issues that I find interesting is when we use the word terrorism and when we don't. And it seems that if it's a Muslim involved in an act of violence, typically the media will report suspected terrorism. If it's not a Muslim, it says suspected gunman. And even though a crime is a crime, it's the way we report and the way we respond and the way our policies are designed to deal with each of those threats. For example, when it comes to homegrown violent extremism, there's statutory powers for surveillance, for so many things, and those happen to be Muslims. Domestic terrorism, which is white nationalists, they don't have the same authorization to do surveillance investigations. So there's a double standard in the policy. So do we need, first of all, can you comment on that double standard if we can address it? And number two, do we need better execution in dealing with all of these crimes? Or do we need more statutory powers to deal with domestic terrorism?
Well, first of all, let me just compliment Impact for the white paper it has done on this issue, which I think would be useful for every member of Congress to read, because
it's right here, by the way.
just so happens.
If you need a copy, we'll give you a copy. Yes.
Well, I think it does a very clear and valuable job in elucidating not only the double standards that you mentioned, but certain steps that we could take to address the problem. And one of the, I think, proposals that we need to move on is one that would establish a crime of domestic terrorism. We are apparently, in these cases, trying to shoehorn this into other statutes. And I think attaching the same kind of stigma to this plague of white supremacist terrorism. It is these are acts of terror that are based on an ideology, and they ought to be covered with the same opprobrium as any other act of terror. And any other tool that can be used to attack any other terrorist ideology ought to be applied to this ideology. Given the trends that we have seen over the last several years, Americans on American soil are at greater risk now of being the victims of white supremacist violence than they are any ISIS or Al-Qaeda inspired violence. And so we need to treat the threat with the level of seriousness, resources, analysis, scrutiny, stigma that it deserves.
Would you like to comment on that issue of double standards and your personal experience on how to deal with crime as a policy matter? Andre?
Yeah, it does strike me as interesting, as you two were engaging that topic, that it seems like in a lot of different ways, white violence is just minimized in general in our country. And I know from my personal experience, just as a black man, as an activist who has tried to speak up about some of the ways that this affects us, not just on a physical level, but also, on a psychological level, to live in a society where you feel persecuted in some ways. It's almost as though we are constantly being told it's not that bad, it's not that big a deal. So I'm not surprised at the notion that the word terror for some people feels like, oh, that's too large of a word, that's too weighted of a word. And so a question came up for me though, as you were just talking, when you said establishing domestic terror as a crime. I can't remember exactly how you phrased it. And I went, wait, that's not a thing?
Well, the reality is it's not a thing. When there are crimes, they can be prosecuted as murders, they can be prosecuted as hate crimes, or if it involves a transnational terrorist movement with an ISIS or Al-Qaeda-like ideology, it can be prosecuted as that kind of transnational terrorist crime. But in terms of a domestic terrorism statute, we don't have one. So we shoehorn the crime into these other statutes that we have. And, I think there are a number of double standards here. When an act of terror is committed by a white person, it is not viewed in the same way as acts of violence committed by people of color. It's not treated in the same way as an act of terror motivated by a radical jihadist view. But at the same time, there's another insidious double standard, and that is when there are acts of violence every day in every American city involving sometimes violence by people of color on other people of color, it is also not treated with the same seriousness. I mean, if we're honest about it, these mass attacks that get our attention kill less people than the everyday gun violence kills people. And there is, I think, a double standard, too, in not devoting the same energy, attention, outrage at the daily carnage in so many American cities.
It also strikes me that it does not reflect on all white men or white people in a general sense, in the way that people have the notion that, black on black crime, right? And people think of black neighborhoods as being dangerous, or in some way, violence becomes a characteristic of black America in the sense that we've had, but in a way that it doesn't reflect on white America, not even to talk about the hundreds of the centuries of white violence in America, but just, the mass shootings recently, we don't look at that and say, well, something's going on in this sector of our community. I feel even scared to even say it, to even utter the words. It feels like I'm transgressing in some way to say that when we hear about these stories, hundreds of mass shootings, many of the perpetrators are white men. Why can't we talk about the root causes of this pattern that we're seeing in the society?
So, Mike, do you want to?
So, yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is I would gladly cede all my time to you, Andre. I love listening to you talk. And because, so I want to comment on a couple things. First of all, the narrative of black on black crime. The truth is violent crime happens in relationships of proximity. We live in a highly segregated nation. And so, yes, there is black on black crime because violence happens in relationships of proximity. And because we're segregated, we have black communities and white communities.
Yes.
There is far more white on white violence than there is black on black violence. And getting to the root causes that you were talking about, I think, is important. And that kind of, and I'm assuming we're going to get there with other questions in terms of what the founding narrative of this country is. Getting back to your question, Salam, in terms of the double standard, when we talk about white supremacy, I'm a big believer in following the money. And one of the things that the history of white supremacy in this country...
I happen to be a big believer in that too, but
Yeah.
in a completely different context.
Yeah. I'm a believer in that context too. Is the history of white supremacy in our country has created vast wealth inequity. And one of the things that has happened over the last 20 years is we've basically removed all the restrictions for corporate ownership of media. And so media now corporations can own, as far as I know, a fairly unlimited number of media sources. So most of the media that we get is mediated by very few corporations. And news has become a profit generator. And so news will be structured to make money from those who benefited from wealth inequality. And so part of what happens in this double standard is that news is being tailored to the fearful appetites of a white America who has the money to spend on the advertisers that the corporations who own the media are making money from. And so I think we talk about, well, what can we do? Well, first of all, I don't know if toothpaste can go back in that tube. I honestly don't. One of the things that we can do is support local independent media in your city and demand good reporting. It is still out there. And we need to be careful curators of the media that we take in. So that's really what I wanted to say about that.
Thank you.
Interested.
I'm going to ask you a question, Brooke, in a second, but I want to announce also we are taking written questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and write them, and we'll have an usher come around and pick up the questions. We'll ask the panelists here. And also, for those who are so tech savvy that they have Twitter, we're tweeting at #RejectWhiteNationalism, all one word, #RejectWhiteNationalism. So we're going to do that. Now, Brooke, I wanted to ask you about the situation that's happening among Muslims and Jews. We find ourselves together in this issue in a very unfortunate way, as the person who shot the people at the Pittsburgh synagogue was thinking in some conspiratorial way or conspiracy theory, saying that Jews were financing Muslim killers to come through the southern border, and that's why he attacked that synagogue. So it's devastating, but we find Muslims and Jews together on these issues. Can you comment how we can work even more closely together on these issues?
Well, I'm so grateful for the ongoing partnership that we have with MPAC and with the Islamic Center and ICAR, and we're part of a much larger group of Jewish and Muslim congregations and organizations working together, and we do show up for each other in these moments. You know, we were all at the Islamic Center together after Christchurch and after the Muslim ban was announced, and your community has shown up for us in these moments too, and we are so grateful for that ongoing partnership and dialogue. And you know, it's one of the myths of the mainstream narrative that we are in constant conflict. We are not. I think very clearly and more in recent years, our communities see one another as partners in combating this shared threat of white supremacy that really is coming after all of us. And the Pittsburgh shooting was a distillation of that, but it's been building for some time. But if I can just really quickly, I wanted to jump back to something we were just talking about a minute ago, which is the notion of domestic terrorism. And I think we ought to maybe question that a little bit before we ingrain it into law, because it seems to me that when we talk about it as domestic, we make it sweet and internal, just like we do with domestic violence. It's something that happens in the home. And I think that white nationalist terrorism actually is already international in a way that is important. And I am not sure why international or transnational white terrorism should somehow have a different and more insular to the United States kind of moniker than jihadist terror. If a person is Muslim and was born in this country and is radicalized through the internet and carries out an act of terror, I'm thinking here perhaps of the shooting in Orlando, Florida, how is that an international terror attack and the man in El Paso is not?
Well, I think you're absolutely right there. We are seeing certainly the shooter in El Paso, the shooter in Christchurch, and others that are inspired in these online forums, and it is really transnational in nature. And we have a statute that deals with that when it is motivated by an ISIS-like ideology, but not when it's motivated by a white supremacist ideology. And, you know, I think my view and others is that there ought to be something, the same kind of both tools, penalties, and stigma attached to those motivated to commit violence by this hateful ideology as any other hateful ideology. And the failure to do so may be part of the reasons why people don't think this is as serious a problem. So it's not that what we would call domestic terrorism doesn't have its own international inspiration. People who are lone actors inspired by Al-Qaeda may be considered homegrown domestic terrorists because they're not acting at the instructions of an Al-Qaeda leader. But there are statutes that are applicable to that violence. There isn't one that's applicable to the violence committed in El Paso. Now, again, there are workarounds, and the prosecutorial authorities are working around. They're using hate crime laws, they're using homicide laws. But I think we ought to bring about the same resources and full force of federal law to this hateful ideology as we do to others.
But Congressman, I mean, do we really need this distinction between homegrown violent extremism and domestic terrorism? I mean, aren't all terrorists, at the end of the day, violent extremists? They're psychotic, they're based on an ideology. So why have that artificial separation?
Well, you know, I guess there are two ways that we could go. We could either change the existing statute to make it less restrictive and less oriented towards international Al-Qaeda, ISIS-like terrorist ideology and crimes that are motivated by it, to one that is more generic in nature, or we can have an equivalent statute that goes after this new rising pernicious threat. At the end of the day, that is, you know, whichever direction we go into is only the most partial of answers. The far bigger imperative is to attack the ideology itself, to delegitimize it, to denormalize it, to not allow not just the president, but anyone we come into contact with to express these vile thoughts. I can tell you from the calls that come into my office, they are markedly different than they were a year ago, which were markedly different than they were the year before that. The kind of hateful spewings, people now feel free to communicate, and that doesn't even begin to describe what we see online. People are feeling now free to express themselves in the most hateful of ways because they hear the president doing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or they hear others do it, or they see the president do it and they don't see an outcry. If you think back to when the president said there were good people on both sides of this Nazi rally, you had members of the president's family, you had members of the president's administration, you had corporate leaders distancing themselves from the president. We saw none of that happen when he told 4 of my colleagues they should go back to where they came from.
That's right.
We saw none of that. And so you can see how already our moral, ethical standards are being dumbed down by this president. You know, I remember thinking early in the presidency that this deeply flawed man who is now the President of the United States was going to infect the whole of government. And it wasn't long at all before that happened, but I remember thinking as I watched him speak before that crowd after Dr. Ford testified, and he was mocking this victim of sexual assault, and people were laughing. You know, expressly what she said was most painful to her was the fact that people thought it was funny at the time that she'd been attacked. And I watched those smiling faces behind the president. I thought, okay, it's gone well beyond infecting the whole of government to infecting the country. And we see just now the degradation between that Nazi rally and today, where there isn't the same pushback response. Who knows where we will be a year from now? And I know we're in a church and a nonpartisan environment here, but this nightmare cannot go beyond next year.
Right.
I have a question on that.
Well, in the spirit of nonpartisanship, so they can't accuse this church of violating any tax law, let me state what the president said today. And I know many people, as you said, Congressman, will see these words as ringing hollow, but maybe there's somebody in the White House or somebody, you know, on the executive branch who is thinking about these things, because I have a hard time believing Trump actually thought of these things. So he first said, according to the White House, Americans must come together in condemning racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. These sinister ideologies must be defeated. Second, law enforcement must have all the tools it needs to investigate and disrupt any hate crimes or acts of domestic terrorism. Third, America must do a better job of identifying and acting upon early warning signs of violence. Today, President Trump directed the Department of Justice to partner with government agencies and the private sector, including social media companies, to develop tools to detect mass shooters before they act. Fourth, we must stop the glorification of violence across society. Fifth, our country must reform its mental health laws to better identify, treat, and if necessary, I know, some of you think start with the White House. Confine individuals who may commit acts of violence. Last but not least, we must ensure that those posing great risk to public safety do not have access to firearms. So on these points, is there a possibility for bipartisanship on these issues? Is this something that can be the silver lining that Republicans and Democrats can work and get behind?
It certainly should be. In a normal world, it would be. We're not in a normal world at the moment. I think, for me, one of the tragic realizations of the last 2 years has been the appreciation that something we knew, we didn't realize the flip side was also true, and that is, I think we knew implicitly that courage is contagious. But what we have learned is so is cowardice. Mm-hmm. And there's been a contagion of cowardice, I think, in our Congress, in the utter unwillingness to stand up to this president in any meaningful way. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle know how wrong and how repugnant the president's actions are. They understand the deep damage he is doing to the country, but they refuse to do anything about it. They will express their private misgivings, but frankly, I'm fed up with private misgivings.
Make sure you tweet that. So,
Salam, you mentioned that maybe this statement wasn't written by the president. We know We know what's been written by the president because he writes it on Twitter. And before that rather anodyne statement of whatever it was, there was the tweets saying that the press is to blame. There were the tweets that say we need immigration reform, which when you read that in the context of this shooting in El Paso basically says that if you don't build my wall or do what I want in immigration, you can expect more shootings like this.
That's right.
That is exactly the opposite of the message we should hear from the president. That is really a ratification of this horrific violence. And so, pardon my skepticism that carefully drafted whatever that is will have any impact on this president. The only thing that's going to move the Congress is if Mitch McConnell and others in the Senate and House GOP realize that voters aren't going to put up with this anymore. And if you're not going to be part of the solution, then you need to get out of the way, or you're going to have your backside voted out of the Congress. That's what it's going to take.
There's been a rash of attacks on houses of worship, black churches, Sikh temples, mosques have been firebombed. What happened in Pittsburgh and Poway. We have a task force I'm actually working on that is looking at preventing targeted violence against houses of worship. One of the fears that we have is that we're going to have armed tanks and armed security guards in front of our churches and synagogues and temples and mosques. How do you see it, Mike and Brooke, in terms of our religious communities? And then also we'll let the Congressman and Andre comment on, the militarization of our society to deal with these threats.
So most synagogues in Los Angeles have been pretty secured for some time now because Jewish communities have felt this level of threat for quite some time. And, it goes back to the Northridge JCC preschool shooting more than 20 years ago in Los Angeles. But I think that the further securitization of our worship spaces does tremendous harm, and that it is mostly security theater, unfortunately, that if somebody is really coming after us with a machine gun, that they're going to be able to get in and kill a lot of people. And we make ourselves feel a little bit better maybe by putting that security guard at the door, but ultimately I don't think that makes us safer. And I think it drains resources that we could be spending on something else, and I think it frightens people away. We want to have our doors open and to be able to welcome people. I find it so different when I come to a church and it's open. There aren't synagogues in Los Angeles that are open that way to welcome people into services, and it is devastating and wrong. And the only way we can fix that, to my mind, is getting rid of the guns. We have got to get guns off our streets. And ultimately, by building relationship with our partners across this country, and by taking on the culture of white supremacy and violence where it lives, because that is the only way we'll actually be safe in our own country.
Thank you.
I want to echo everything that you just said. I want to be careful in my comments here as particularly not being critical of synagogues and temples and mosques who have chosen a different road than we've chosen here at All Saints. And part of that is because in addition to white supremacy and patriarchy which exist in this country, I hesitate to call it Christian supremacy, because what is masquerading as Christianity, which I do not believe is Christianity, is a theology that has a great deal of supremacy in this country. Because of that, there is a level where it is easy for us to say that we're a gun-free campus because we are not a target in the same kind of way. Something else that is a key piece to us for this, and it actually goes back to the president's comments, which is, I thought, for his comments or whoever wrote that for him, that he went directly from talking about the evil of white supremacy to saying we need to strengthen law enforcement shows a profound lack of understanding of the effects of white supremacy in this country. And the presence of armed security or police in a house of worship, while it might make certain populations feel safer, will make populations of color in general feel less safe. And so we need to recognize that, people like me were raised with a certain view of law enforcement. Not everyone in this country has that view, and that's also a piece of the coming together that we need to do, is to listen to those different narratives and have significant law enforcement reform in this country. And it is why, when we talk about things like, bringing security and law enforcement into churches, that's a key piece of what we need to look at.
Congressman, you mentioned that part of the problem is underreporting of these crimes, by the FBI, and I want to drill down a little bit more on something, that Mike just mentioned, and that is the problem of bias within law enforcement, within some members, at least, of law enforcement, that is eroding the partnership between communities and law enforcement. The communities don't feel safe with law enforcement around, as opposed to having that healthy partnership that helps secure these houses of worship and communities in general. So how do we deal with this problem that is spreading among many vulnerable communities, minority communities, where there's not that trust? How do we help rebuild that trust? And Andre, I want you to comment on that as well.
Well, this reminds me of a hearing we had a couple of years ago in the Intel Committee in how the FBI was categorizing different types of crimes. And one of the categories of crime was described, and I may not get the exact phraseology correct, as black identity extremism.
Right.
And so we had a conversation with the FBI about what does this refer to? And how many cases of this have there even been? Does it make sense to describe this in its own category if the illustrations of it really don't even seem to meet the definition? And if you're putting out guidance to local law enforcement about this type of crime, are you going to essentially cause law enforcement to see different communities as a danger in certain ways, or different organizations? They have subsequently done away with that category, but they have adopted other categories which now blend different forms of extremism in a way that is that puts at risk, and this was the subject of another hearing we had much more recently, getting good data on specific types of extremism, like white supremacist extremism. If you group all racially motivated hate within one category, then you may miss the forest for the trees. So we are examining both how law enforcement is analyzing this, how they are reaching out and training local law enforcement, what biases may be part of that training. Part of the issue, it was readily apparent when we had this hearing and we brought in those that were developing the categories, it was a very non-diverse group, to put it politely. And they weren't particularly knowledgeable also about how these categories had been used in the past in a way that perpetuated racial stereotyping. Because they didn't have that sensitivity. They didn't know how these provisions had been abused in the past. And it was helpful that our committee was far more diverse than the Bureau itself or than this group that was working on these issues. So there's a lot more work to be done there. And I benefit tremendously from the diversity in the House and the diversity in our caucus. The reality is, try as we might, none of us are fully able of stepping into each other's shoes. We're just not. We haven't lived that. And when we were talking earlier about how we look at crime and how we look at crime committed by whites and crime committed by blacks, I was thinking about all of the cell phone video that has come to light of law enforcement violence against people of color. of those shootings. And I think that for a great many people who are not of color, it was an incredible realization of the extent of the problem. And, I feel like my colleagues in Congress have every right to grab me by the lapels and say, did you not hear what we were saying? Because now you can see it. And so, I think that, certainly in my job, and having a very diverse intelligence committee and having a very diverse caucus, in being able to learn from other people how they see the world through the lens of their own experience and how different it might be than my own, has been of vital importance. And we need to make sure, and one of the things that we're doing with the intelligence community, which is historically non-diverse, and the CIA, historically very non-diverse, is we've been having hearings on diversifying the intelligence community. And so I think that's part of the answer.
You mentioned rebuilding trust between law enforcement and communities of color. And it's such an interesting phrase, rebuilding trust.
Okay.
Because if you were to rewind to the 60s and read the I Have a Dream speech from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he would say in the beginning of that speech, the Negro can never be satisfied as long as he is dealing with the reality of police brutality in this country. That's in the 60s.
Yeah.
If you rewind some more, our ancestors go back, we're having the same conversations we've been having. So even the question, I would cut the legs out from the beginning and say, when did we trust the police?
Right.
As people of color, as black people, when could we? We couldn't. And so if people of color are ever going to trust law enforcement, then law enforcement is going to have to muster as much integrity as Domino's Pizza, because at least Domino's in 2014 said, hey, we made bad pizza. We're sorry about that. We're gonna make better pizza. And then we did, then they did. And it's a real example though, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They acknowledged that they had broken trust, right? They said we're going to do better, and then they did.
That's right.
Now I order from Domino's.
Yep.
But we can't get law enforcement to do that much, right? To say, listen, the first police departments started off as slave patrols and started off as a way for white America to keep indigenous people off of their property, because we invented that too so that we could do a lot of violence. It's a whole nother conversation. And to make sure that black people were on our plantations, right? And that legacy is still a part of the way that these institutions function. We can't be honest about that in this country. So if we can't be honest about that and then say we're going to change and then do better, then we can't trust them. And so we will be able to trust law enforcement when law enforcement proves themselves trustworthy. Period.
Here's a question from the audience, very interesting. It says, how do we make space for the average white American, especially men, who are particularly vulnerable to becoming radicalized in white supremacy, to join us against white terrorism? Anybody want to comment on that?
Okay, I'll take that one on.
Yeah,
I'm not sure I completely.
yeah.
I'm not sure. As one of the two white men on this panel, I'm not sure I completely understand it. What I will jump to from that is, for us white folks, who are at least at some level of recognizing that white supremacy is a thing and is part of the founding narrative, we got to get our cousins. For too long, this has been a conversation that people of color have been burdened with raising and continuing and sustaining. And so for whatever piece of it is, and I look out here and I see a lot of white faces tonight, and I'm actually really, really glad of that. To have this many white faces show up to a conversation about white supremacy is something 5 years ago I don't know that I would have thought I would have seen. So this is incredibly hopeful. Yeah. And so you talked about how courage is contagious and cowardice is contagious. And both of those things are contagious around the Thanksgiving table. And in family gatherings and at weddings. And we need to have the courage to go get our cousins. Because if people can be radicalized to extremist hate, then people can be radicalized to radical love. And that's our job to do that. So that's how I would answer that question.
Another question here, interesting. What is the best way to address and acknowledge our region's own history of white supremacy? And I think under you're referring to the past. For example, Glendale's past status as a sundown town.
Yep. Ferguson.
Is that?
But
I see people looking at me.
No.
I see people looking
I'm just looking at you because you're next to me.
Okay.
But anyway,
I can comment on that. I mean, something that I hear in this conversation as a whole has to do with what some movement scholars talk about as the symbolic contest. And what they're referring to is that literally half the battle when we're talking about change has to do with narratives, common sense, our common held beliefs together. We have a culture where it's like in the air, it's a smog of falsehood. We can't talk about these things because in order to do that, we have to indict white America. We have, and I know that a lot of white people feel guilt and shame and don't know how to deal with that kind of thing, and so it becomes a boundary line that we can't cross. We have to do something about the air quality that we're living in. We have to do something about that. And so, I've been thinking about this as we talk because so much of this, when you talk about, the question about the young men who are, vulnerable to being radicalized, a part of it has to do with the fact that in history class we are not taught an accurate version of our history, and so, and we have these myths about, a lot of these white supremacists believe that, there is an attack on the white race and you are in danger of disenfranchisement and oppression and annihilation, right? All of these lies that are in the air, and we need to combat. We need to combat that, and we have to be active about combating that. And I think that faith leaders have such a huge role in this because where else in the country are hundreds and thousands of people waking up at 9 in the morning on Sunday to one of your only weekend days and coming and sitting down in front of you and saying, teach me how to be a better person.
Or Saturday. Or, yeah.
Yeah. Like, or Sabbath or Friday or,
Right.
Tell me how to be a better person. How should I live, right? You're in such a unique position to do that. And people who are in media, educators, artists, that we have to contend in this symbolic contest with all of this smog. I think that it has to be a part of it.
I know this is a heavy discussion here tonight. I think, on a more optimistic note, that our young people are going to lead the way. And, I'm impressed that, in families all across America, in white families all across America, kids are coming home from college and talking about white privilege. Yeah. Something that did not happen, I think, when my generation came back from college. And there's, of course, that eternal truth that I think was either Twain or Rogers who said, when I went to college, couldn't believe how ignorant my old man was. And when I got back 4 years later, I was amazed at all the old man had learned. I think the kids are coming back and they're educating their parents. And I think that's very positive. I think that notwithstanding that a lot of these acts of hate are carried out by angry, young, white men. Nonetheless, there is an intolerance towards bigotry by young people that is far more pronounced than of their parents. And I still believe that the moral arc of the universe is bending towards justice. And it's the new generation that gives me hope, even as it's some of the members of that generation that have committed these heinous acts.
Thank you. Brooke? Well, if you can also, I think we do have to wrap up for the next, so that we can have the next panel here. I think one of the issues one of our existential issues is this idea of pluralism in American society. It's something that we hear about a lot, we talk a lot about it, it's just not experienced. And a lot of times the opposite is experienced. It's the violation of people's rights based on race. There's still that deeply embedded satanic whisper of racism in our society. We're taught that Satan was the first racist because he told God, I'm better than Adam because I'm made out of fire and he's made out of clay. And those who say I'm better because I'm made white and they're made brown or they're made this and that is racism. And unfortunately, a lot of religions, all of our religions, have been exploited to support racism. So what do we do as religious communities to combat this idea of racism within that has a religious veneer, this sense of religious nationalism? And then what can we do, all of us, to support, what is that one action I think that you can identify we need to do to move the needle on this idea of pluralism in our society?
So I'll speak to that briefly. I think that, look, in Judaism, the most important thing that we learn is that all people are created in the image of God. And that's a radical idea that says that when you look at every other person, you're supposed to literally see God in that person. And I think that idea is contained in every major world religion, while it's also true that our religions can be and have been used to foment hate and a kind of ethno-nationalism and separation. I think that we have to begin by teaching the parts of our religion that lift up the divinity of each human being and the value of each human life. And then we have to build relationships. We have to start talking to one another. We need to start finding out all the ways in which, in fact, we're not in conflict. Salam and I have participated through another organization in a kind of Muslim-Jewish and Christian dialogue effort. And one of the things we talk about and learn there is that really we tend to imagine that the other people think much worse of us than they actually do. And that if we sit down and start talking to one another, we find out that they don't hate us so much, and then our own sense of fear and hatred is lowered. And we start to talk about, what do we have in common? What do we agree on? And that doesn't take away the ways in which we disagree or the conflict that we do have. That's still there, and it's very real, and we have to address that. But until we're actually talking to one another at all and finding out what we might have in common, what our shared values are, what our shared hopes are for a shared society, we can't even begin. And so I think that's where we have to start.
Thank you.
I agree. And really, to go off what you said, in a couple days on August 9th, it will be the 5th anniversary of Michael Brown's murder in Ferguson. And what happened in the wake of that was people from all faiths and different faiths coming together, but it's important who led that. It was women who led that. And it was it was Tracy Blackman, it was Susan Talvey, a rabbi, it was Rebecca Ragland, Karen Anderson, it was young gender non-conforming and queer women, Brittany Farrell, Alexis Templeton, Kayla Reed, who came together, and their single-mindedness for justice that overcame all the different divisions. And while the men were fighting about who was going to be up in front, the women were getting the work done. And one of the things that I think it is clear that I'm grateful, the president is speaking out against the squad because he's scared. because those are powerful women. And I need to be quiet so Susan Russell can get up here talking about powerful women. And so I think part of what we do, what we need to do as male leaders of faith, is we need to start getting out of the way and letting some women lead, because they do this incredibly well.
Andre?
You mentioned the one thing that we should do. And I don't know the one thing that you should do, but I do know the one thing that you should know. The one thing that you should know is that history is not a story that is happening to us. It is a story that we are writing together. The things that we see in this society, no matter what it is, we talk about the concentration camps or male supremacy and patriarchy and mass incarceration and all those kinds of things, they can't be carried out by one person. It's not the DA, it's not the Attorney General, it's not the President. Donald Trump cannot go capture migrant children and process them and build prisons and all the other tasks. We provide those services. And so if the status quo is preserved by our collective yes, it can be changed through our collective no. History is not a story that is happening to us. It is a story that we are writing together. You know, then, the one thing that you can do. My friend Melissa in New York told me a story. I'm going to stop talking, but hey, I don't know when else I'll get a chance to do this. She said, come back. She told me that she has a neighbor that watches people's kids when they go to protest. And I said, that's the movement. Because see, without the woman that says, I'll watch your kids, the protesters don't get to go, right? So I can't tell you the one thing that you should do, because only you can know if you're supposed to go and march, or if you're supposed to watch somebody's kids, or if you're supposed to answer phones or give money or volunteer or whatever. Only you know that. But what you must know is that you are writing the story with us. You are so powerful that even if you say, I don't matter, I won't write, that your decision to do that actually affects the story. Your refusal to intervene on behalf of the marginalized, the vulnerable, it will have an effect. That's the one thing you should know.
Yeah, I want you to close, but I also want you to, if you can, in your closing comments, if you can tell us as advocates how we can do a better job. Because I think, number one, you're doing a great job representing us. And the idea of this forum is to have a partnership between our communities and our decision makers, so that the laws that are passed are more representative of all of us. And if you can comment on that, obviously, I'm sure you have a lot of other things to comment on, but tell us how we can be better advocates.
Well, Salam, thank you. And I just want to thank you for the partnership that you and I have had. Really, all of us have had. When you were talking about the shooter who went into the Tree of Life and how he was motivated because he thought the Jews were financing Muslims coming into the country, I kept thinking of our two communities and something Ben Franklin once said, either we hang together or we hang separately. This is true, I think, for all of us. We're all in this together. And I keep coming back to something that I have referred to often over the last couple of years, but really had in mind something very different that I had taken away from it at the time. It involved John McCain, who I got to know in the last few years of his life and traveled with and came to really admire and respect and miss deeply, because if there was ever a time that we needed an independent, courageous voice, it's now. But one of the wonderful things about traveling with John McCain is he could invite anyone he wanted to dinner and they would come. And so at one point we had dinner with Bill Gates and Bono, which is, I don't know about you, but not my usual dinner company. And the night wore on and we had dessert and we had drinks and we started telling jokes, and Bono told a joke about being Irish. And then he got very serious and he said, I'm very proud of being Irish, I'm very proud of Ireland, but Ireland, like most countries, is just a country. America is also an idea. And the moment he said it, I realized this is what is at risk right now, the very idea of America. At the time, and I think since I had thought about the challenge to that idea being one owing to our country's affinity for the despots of the world, the love affair we were having with Kim Jong-un and whatever it is we're having with Vladimir Putin, and the disdain we show to our allies, those godforsaken Canadians and the British and the Germans and the French and the Australians and the New Zealanders, and how we are at this inflection point where, having lived in a world in which we're ever increasing in our freedoms around the world, we cannot say that will be true next year. But I've come to see that the idea of America is also at risk, as much of the world has thought of us as a melting pot where people have come from all over the world fleeing violence and seeking a better life, and that we were proof that there didn't have to be a caste system and that there was upward mobility, and that idea is being challenged. And, you know, we can all say, well, that idea has never really been the reality. But even the idea now is being challenged. And this, I think, is part of what is at stake. In terms of what we can do on this platform and what you can do in the congregation, and I need to say how much admiration I have for All Saints, because you are a congregation of doers. And you always have been. And it's remarkable when I think of how many institutions and other things All Saints has created in this community, in this region. But I think all of us, the wonderful thing about being alive is all of us can contribute. It's all about finding where we can add the most value. It's true in the Congress. The House is a big place. You need to figure out, where can I have one out of 435 add value? But it's true in the congregation, all of our congregations. It's true in all of our lives. And you're absolutely right. It's not the same answer for everyone because we occupy different places. But the beautiful thing is we can all contribute. Right. And I think our society needs us right now. Our country needs us right now. The rest of the world needs us right now. So this is a time for each of us to dig deep and say, where can I do the most good? And if we do that, we have a bright future ahead.
Amen. Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists.
What a pleasure.
Thank you for this.
How can you deal with the white supremacy without dealing with the white supremacists in the White House? How can you ever hope to end structural violence if you can't hold the president accountable for his violations of the law? How can you? Are you too afraid of losing to make sure the president doesn't violate the law? Did you take a pledge to defend the Constitution? Did you take? Is the fight?
So we're going to have our next panel.
Is the president violating the law? Is that constitutional? Is the president?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Everybody, please remain seated. We're going to have our second panel. Come on up.
You're up, Susan.
Are you afraid of the president? Are you afraid of the president? Are you afraid of the president? Are you afraid to hold the president accountable for his violations of the law? Are you
All right.
afraid?
Let's close this door. Let's close this door. Thank you. Yeah, you can come back in.
Well, we're going to have our second panel.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I forgot.
Sorry.
Come on up.
Forgot about Sabbath. Oh my gosh.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats so that we can resume the program. I hope that
that's your
this
job.
little incident does not distract us from really reporting the truth about a great conversation we're having, so we're going to continue it right now. So with us now, we have Omar Ricci, who's the chairman of the Islamic Center of Southern California, is also a reserve LAPD officer, and we talked a lot about the issues involving law enforcement. He testified to the Congress on the inaction of confronting white supremacy. And Susan Russell is the Associate Director of Communication for All Saints Church. So we're going to talk more about our communities. But first, I wanted Omar to give a summary of the testimony you gave to the Congress and what you think the members on the Oversight Committee that were listening, what your observations were in terms of their actions at this time.
Well, first of all, thank you to All Saints.
Get your mic. Manny?
I think just give it a minute.
Hold on a second.
And go ahead.
Y'all hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Well, first of all, thank you to really the All Saints Church and the All Saints Church community for hosting this forum. We are extraordinarily grateful and thankful for having All Saints Church.
Did he get
And
escorted off
it even
the
brings some
property?
of the fireworks that we just saw here just now.
Okay, I just want to make sure you got escorted off.
As far as the testimony that I gave back in May to the House Government Oversight and Reform Committee, I was there as one of 5 witnesses. I was there as an impact witness. Even though I'm an LAPD officer, I was there as an impact witness. And let me just say from the outset that whatever I say tonight, whatever views I express are that of my own and the Islamic Center of Southern California. I am here not in any capacity as my LAPD, as an LAPD officer. Just want to make that clear. But my testimony in May was as an impact witness because as the chairperson of the Islamic Center of Southern California, as a leading national Islamic center and institution, we have been the target of hate. And there have been things that have been sent to us. There was actually a person who called and threatened one of our front desk staff members to kill that person. When law enforcement tracked that person down, he had a cache of automatic weapons and thousands of rounds of ammunition just here in the Southern California area. So we have been impacted by the change in administration in the White House. And my role there was to go and talk about how it has impacted us, not only as the Islamic Center of Southern California, but as Muslims in Southern California and across the nation. This past weekend, the terror in El Paso and in Dayton, my phone started to ring. What are we going to do with our upcoming Eid prayers? We have an Eid prayer that's coming up, which is one of the holiest days in the Islamic calendar. We're going to have thousands of people coming together for prayer. What are we doing to secure our prayers? And I think, like somebody said earlier on the previous panel, it's a really sad state of affairs when the spiritual has to go into being more of the military lockdown that we are starting to see our mosques become. And so, again, going back to the congressional testimony, I was there to really talk about how our community has been impacted.
Susan, you've seen a lot of struggles. You're part of many struggles yourself. On this one, do you see a light at the end of the tunnel? I mean, sometimes listening to the concerns of many of our community members seems like just doesn't change. So what do you see as that opportunity for change?
I think for me, and again, thank you to MPAC for hosting this, and it's a delight to have everyone here. I think it's such a critically important conversation. I think what gives me hope in the struggle is the struggles that we've had so far. I'm a white woman of privilege, overeducated Episcopal clergy type. I'm also a lesbian, so in some contexts, I'm on the fringe. In others, I have privilege. What I've recognized is, we were talking before we gathered, a lot of what I've learned about the resistance. I learned about resisting conservative Episcopalians as we fought the inclusion struggle in the Episcopal Church. And what I learned was patriarchy is a thing. And as our sister Barbara Harris, the first African American and first woman bishop in the Anglican Communion, said, it is on its deathbed, but it is not going quietly into this good night. And I am convinced that what we're seeing right now, all of these intersections of all of these challenges are part of that common struggle. And it is a struggle for not only the soul of America, but the soul of humanity. And will we, as our sister said, see God in each other, or will we see each other as other? And every time we other people, we participate in bigotry and discrimination and the kind of polarization we're seeing right now. Now, I remember a time, again, as a queer person, when we had lots, and I was very gratified by what Rep. Schiff had to say, how courage is contagious and so is cowardice. There was a time when it was not easy for our allies to stand with us as LGBTQ people. Muslim friends who loved us couldn't stand for equal marriage. We had people across the board who said, well, I'm with you in principle, but my board, but my donors. And over decades of that kind of work, building solidarity with each other, showing up with each other at each other's events, listening to each other's stories. I will never forget Salam Al-Marayati when we stood on the steps of the Islamic Center together, grieving the Orlando shooting, and I heard the words come out of your mouth. Our words at MPAC to the LGBTQ community is, if they're coming for you, they have to get past us first. And I hold those moments. I hold those moments as iconic of what we're talking about here, of that ability to build community across difference, to know each other's stories, to share each other's narratives, to argue with each other's theology, and yet to hold those common values together. So, long answer to your great question. Thanks for asking.
That was a great answer. I just wanted to then ask you to elaborate on this idea of, number one, removing the otherization. And again, similar to the question I asked the previous panel, that otherization happens a lot within religion. Mm-hmm. And so, to religious leaders that I'm talking to, how do you see that happening, manifesting itself within our religious community?
Well, I wouldn't consider myself a religious leader, first of all.
Well, you're the chairman of the Islamic Center.
I'm more of an activist than a religious leader.
Yeah. You're not a theologian.
Certainly not a theologian.
Right.
Look, the otherization is a very important question in the context of what this discussion is about, which is the rise of white supremacy. And, when I sit back and I think about it, even in 2016 when Donald Trump was on the path to being elected president, in my mind, and I don't know how many people share this, is that this is really also about control of our country. The demographics of our nation is changing. Mm-hmm. It is going from being a majority white country to a majority minority country. And I was just reading something in the year 2045, the white community will make up less than 50% of the population. The remainders will be minorities. And throughout history, any group, any demographic, any race that is in a position of losing power or control in some form or another attempts to fight back, attempts to resist that change, attempts to demonize the other. And I think this is what you are seeing in the presidency of Donald Trump. I think you are seeing the demonization of Hispanics, of Latinos, of LGBT community members, of so many others, in an attempt to try and keep power, to try and keep control, to try and push away the tide, whether that be immigrants from the South or immigrants from the Muslim world or from wherever. If you're not white, if you're not, and you know, there's a movie called The Good Shepherd with Matt Damon. And in that movie, there's a line that I will never forget. He's in a scene with Joe Pesci, and Matt Damon plays basically, I think, a CIA agent, or he plays a government agent, and Joe Pesci is playing the role of an Italian mobster. And Joe Pesci said, look, you know, Matt Damon was telling Joe Pesci, hey, look, if you don't stop your mobster ways, we're going to deport you. And Joe Pesci says, look, I was born and raised here. And Matt Damon said something that I think is very apropos for this day. He goes, if you're not white and if you're not Christian, you're just a visitor. And, you know, I think, you know, this is Hollywood and entertainment sort of showing a light on society. So I think what we're seeing here is a change in racial dynamics in the country playing out. I also see happening here a religious change in the role of Christianity and how Christianity has been such an important part of our nation. You're now seeing, you know, a large Muslim influx, a Jewish influx. So I think you're seeing that as well playing out in some of this white supremacy that we're being affected by today.
And you are seeing the good news of the radical rabbi from Nazareth, who was himself a Palestinian, hijacked and used as a weapon of mass discrimination. And that is something that if Christians are not standing up against, we're not doing our job. Now, as Episcopalians, one of our baptismal covenant promises is to respect the dignity of every human being. There is no asterisk that says, unless their papers aren't in order, or unless they go to a mosque instead of a church, or you can fill in the blanks. So for me as a Christian, I think right now watching the rise of Christian supremacy is just so antithetical to the core values of our gospel, and yet there's hope. Some of you may have seen it. If not, go Google it. It was awesome. Last week, our Washington National Cathedral, our Bishop of Washington, Marianne Buddy, yes, thank you, offered a very stern rebuke in very clear terms to Donald Trump. We haven't seen that kind of leadership from national church officials, and we need to see more of it. There's also a rising tide of Christians against Christian supremacy. If you haven't signed on to the letter yet, go to the All Saints website. You can find it and sign on to it. We have. I think it's that, again, on your earlier panel, the collective voice can make a difference. We are finding our voice together, and, I mean, Politics 101, I mean, I was a poli-sci major, and, you know, Politics 101 is the way you win is you solidify your base, and then you work to divide and minimize the opposition, okay? So the base is the base. Not to be partisan about it, but I'm talking about values. If we're talking about values that we share, we are a majority. We are a supermajority. If we come together, we really can overcome that, you know, famous line from Dr. Martin Luther King that only light can overcome darkness. Darkness cannot overcome itself. So.
Thank you. In the last panel, we talked a lot about law enforcement, and I know, Omar, you're a reserve LAPD officer, and I just want you to speak about this issue. One of the questions that came to us from the audience is, how can we address the issue of white nationalism, xenophobia, and violent misogyny in our law enforcement agencies at the city, county, state level of government?
Well, I certainly can't speak on behalf of all law enforcement in the nation, number one. Number two, I would ask, as a police officer, that you not do to the law enforcement community what is done to Muslims, what is done to Jews, that you don't take the whole and demonize them based on the actions of a few. I can only tell you about my 10 years of experience within the LAPD, and that is that if you even utter a thought about somebody who's African American or somebody who's Muslim or something, you are not going to get very far within the department.
the department, sort of like a body that has an infection, it pushes people out who do that. I mean, one of the things that has recently come about at the LAPD is something called implicit bias training. That is a mandated training that every single sworn police officer had to take within the LAPD. And as the name implies, implicit bias is that if you see somebody that looks a certain way or somebody that dresses a certain way, we all as human beings have natural biases, but us in the role as police officers, and again, I'm not speaking on behalf of the LAPD, just to be clear, but us, we have a special responsibility to not let our own personal biases come out. So I'm very proud of being a member of the LAPD. Now, does that mean that law enforcement across the nation doesn't have its problems? Of course not. If you go to Podunk, Iowa, where it's, Billy Bob, I'm sorry to say these names, whatever, Billy Bob, and then sort of your local police force with the good old boys, yeah, I'm sure you would experience something there. And not every community in the and by the way, law enforcement is a reflection of the community that they should be servicing. So if you go to a town in the Midwest that is predominantly white and they're not used to seeing a Muslim woman in hijab, there was an incident, I think somewhere in the Midwest, when there was an Arab man who came out in his galabeah and they thought he was a terrorist and they took out their AR-15s and what have you. You're going to have those incidences. But I personally, like Congressman Schiff, am optimistic that law enforcement with these incidences that are coming out, with these handheld cameras that are coming out and videotaping things, their behavior and their training and their actions will be more in line, one, with constitutional rights, number two, civil rights, and number three, just basic human rights as well. I think that is what we are finding in our law enforcement as a trend. There are bad apples. Just like there are bad Muslims, bad Jews, bad Christians, there are bad apples in law enforcement. And I can tell you, certainly within LAPD, you cannot sustain yourself as a police officer if you're that type of personality.
Thank you. Susan, you talk about Christian supremacy and many of the problems within Christianity. Yet, I would think that just like there is in every religion, these are not the majority of people. So, is it worth bridging the divide with some of these more, for lack of a better term, fundamentalist groups? And B, how do we mobilize or galvanize the silent majority among our religious community to be that light against this darkness?
It's a great question. I want to tell a quick story first. I don't know if you'll remember. Some of you will remember a number of years ago during the summer, we did an interfaith preaching series here at All Saints Church. And we had Leonard Bierman, Rabbi Leonard Bierman of blessed memory, was one of our preachers. Yeah, let's give a hand for Leonard. And Maher Hatut was another, and I got to be the third. So we had 3 Sundays in a row where we had these awesome opportunities. It was a huge privilege. And I still remember the week Dr. Hatut was here. And he preached a brilliant sermon, which I think you can still find online. And if you can't, Keith and I are going to find it and put it up later. But in it, he basically said that we share the same values, we're part of the same wider family, and he needed to work on being the best Muslim he could be and leave his Jewish friends to be the best Jews they could be and help Christians be the best Christians we could be, and together we could change the world. And everyone said amen, and we walked out of church, and there across the street on wheels was a life-size Bible with a guy with a bullhorn. And the Bible said, the Holy Bible by Jesus. So if you're not laughing at that, I invite you to come back on Sunday and sign up for an education class. But as we walked out, and this man was yelling horrible things about Muslims across the street, and I was, both terrified and horrified and embarrassed. And I had Dr. Hatut was holding my arm, and I said, "Oh, doctor, I'm so embarrassed about our misbehaving cousins across the street." And he patted my hand and he said, there, dear. We all have bad cousins. And frankly, mine are worse than yours. So the point of that quick story, which is just kind of fun, is also recognizing the reality that within our faith families, we have challenges and we need to work on them within our families, within our communities. And then this is going to be shameless self-promotion. So Starting September 1st, this diocese, the Diocese of Los Angeles, is launching a brand new initiative under the leadership of our Bishop John Taylor. It's called One in the Spirit, and the goal is to spend the next 3 years with an intentional initiative of creating resources and opportunities to talk to each other across divides, whether they're gender, whether they're economic, whether they're cultural, whether they're, binary and non-binary, theological, everything we can think of. And I've been asked to come on staff and be part of that, and I'm very excited about it. And I hope you will be too, and I hope you'll participate in it. And it reminds me a lot of what Rep. Smith was charging us to do, is that find the ways to have those hard conversations. Whether Mike Kinman, good luck at Thanksgiving with your family, we're going to give it a shot with ours. I mean, those are sometimes the hardest conversations to have, are those ones across the Thanksgiving table. And we need to equip and empower and resource each other, and also pray for each other when we're in that vortex, because thoughts and prayers are never enough, but they have to be part of the process.
Great, thank you. We have time for 1 or 2 questions, and I'll go ahead and allow people to stand up and state their questions verbally if you'd like. Anyone? Okay.
Maybe you can give them a second.
Yeah, usually the first question is the hardest to ask, so we'll start with the second question. Yes, ma'am. And come on up so we can hear you, and then we'll repeat the question for everybody else. Uh-oh. Right there's fine. Right.
I thank you for the moment that I could ask this question. I specifically came here for this. And I want you to know that this Donald Trumpism is all over the globe. He is inspiring leaders of other countries to be just like him. I am a relative of the President of the Philippines, and I hate what is being done to my country. They're selling it to China. And does anybody in our Senate and our countries can help this poor country? They're sold out.
Okay.
I came
Thank
to
you.
the Philippines, to help my country, to have this help with the climate change and help with racism, help with whatever we could do to give back to my country. But what did they do? I thought he was a good man. He's a relative of mine. But even me as his relative, I was stepped on, I was defrauded, I was swindled, my family almost got, we were robbed, I almost got killed with my car. What can we do? Help us.
So, thank you. I'm
This is
really
a-
sorry about
Thank
your
you.
experience. Right. So I think the question is twofold, is that the white nationalism has inspired nationalism across borders and is now an international problem. And now this person who is a relative of the president of the Philippines feels that her country in the Philippines is being sold out to Chinese economic interests, and that we're becoming that countries and populations are becoming conglomerates of all these economic powers. So what do we do? How do we deal with these two problems? And we're going to let these experts respond.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your
very
question.
much. Thank you.
And I'm sorry for your experience.
Thank you. Okay.
Protect us, protect my family, because
Yeah.
We need to get her to sit.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll
Let me see if I can address your question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
this report.
Okay.
I went to the FBI,
Thank you.
went to Congressman
Yeah.
All right. You can.
warning us,
Yes.
writing to Senator
Okay.
Kamala Harris. I just spoke to
Yeah.
Congressman Adam Schiff.
Thank you.
Please help us.
All right. So we're going to have these people
I think
answer.
the tide of nationalism in general. So let me see if I can sort of address the question here. Again, I'm not familiar with the specifics of the Philippines, but I mean, there's President
I think
Duarte.
the rise of nationalism internationally.
I think, again, what you are seeing here are people of a certain economic status quo or a certain racial status, wanting to maintain a certain status quo, that are trying to hold on to their control, trying to hold on to their power. I think you see that. I think you see that here in the United States. I think you see that in parts of Eastern Europe. I was just reading a Wall Street Journal article the other day about how in Turkey now, who was at one point very welcoming of the Syrian refugees, they are now starting to, there's a backlash against Syrian refugees of all people, the most destitute, the most downtrodden. So, and it goes to show that it's a challenge to our humanity, that we are seeking to address some of these things. So I understand what's happening in the Philippines with the strong man that he is, and some of the extrajudicial killings that are happening there as well, and that's something that I think is symptomatic. Yes.
Well, we're certainly seeing it as we're looking at the protests happening in Russia right now and the tamping down. But again, looking for the hope, the light at the end of the tunnel, the pony under the pile, whatever your metaphor is. Think about what happened when we had the Women's March, and that was a global movement. And we looked at the global movement of those in the streets being led by women and young people standing up and speaking out. Those are the kind of mobilization and opportunities we need to seize and leverage, mobilize, and participate in as we move ahead.
Thank you. I think that's a perfect segue to our closing. If you'd like to give a closing comment now. Again, here we have a congregation, we have people. How can we become better advocates? Is there one thing that we should be focusing on to create that change, to move the needle on countering white supremacy and all these forms of religious nationalism?
So when I hear about white supremacy and the rise of white supremacy, I think it's important for myself as an American Muslim that I don't do to my brothers and sisters in the white community that which has been done to me in my community. I'm not going to go tomorrow and look at the white guy walking next to me on the street and say, oh my God, 20-something-year-old kid say, are you going to pull out an AK-47? Are you one of those violent? So what I'm trying to say is I think it's important that we as a nation not overreact. That's number one. Number two, Dr. Hassan Hathout, the brother of Dr. Maher Hathout, he said something that was so simply profound, that the world is not divided into Christians and Jews and Muslims and Buddhists and Sikhs. It's divided into people who believe and do good and those that don't. Mm-hmm. And so we, I think, in this hall tonight, in this church tonight, are part of, we know where we stand. And we know that the idea that was being talked about before by Congressman Schiff, the idea of America, the experiment of America, and there was a recent video that was circulating about what former President Ronald Reagan said, which is that immigrants can go to France, but they can't become Frenchmen. They can go to Ireland, but they can't become Irishmen. They can go to another country, but they can't become part of that country. They can come to America and be American. And so that idea, that experiment, that concept is something that we have to band together and protect, promote, and evolve. Thank you.
I just want to very quickly echo so much of what we've heard tonight, and something Andre said, and I think Rep. Schiff as well, about being the ideals of liberty and justice for all have always been aspirational. We have never achieved that. But for Christians, it's like thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. We pray for it every time we gather, and we're not there yet. But the fact that we aspire to it is powerful. And the fact that we are a nation of ideals gives us that common ground to build on. And so I am, I'm ontologically hopeful. I mean, I have my bad days, but I think as we aspire and continue to grow forward, I think for me the most important thing I saw, again, our Bishop John Taylor offered a 3-point suggestion today on what we need to do. And number one was ban assault weapons, period, out of the box. Number 2 was get out the vote. And not to tell people how to vote, because we don't do that, but to tell them to vote and to make sure that the turnout is so great and so stupendous that it is not a wave but a tsunami of those who believe in what's best about America and are going to raise up all Americans, not just some Americans. So I think those are the, and then the third, of course, was the talking across difference and the commitment to have conversations and relationships with those with whom you disagree, not always in order to change their mind, but in order to touch their heart and in order to create that place and that space where healing and hope can grow.
Thank you. I want to thank All Saints Church for hosting this forum, and thank all of you for being with us. I think the main message of hope lies in people like you who are struggling for the truth. And a lot of these policies and racist ideologies that are spreading based on falsehood. Mm-hmm. And in our scripture, there are 2 things I would like to reference that I think encapsulates the whole discussion tonight. First, it says, "O you who believe, you have been made to establish justice, and you will have to be witnesses to the truth and testify to God, even if that testimony is against yourself or your family or your community." God's precedence rises above everything else on speaking for the truth. We have to speak the truth to be that light against falsehood. Number 2, while so many religions are busy with religious conversion, first of all, God is the one who tells us what religion is about and gives the freedom of every individual to choose that religion. It is not my job to tell somebody what religion they choose or anyone else what religion they cannot choose. But it is my responsibility and duty to give people the freedom to choose. So if it's not religious conversion, what we are told is the best kind of conversion is to convert people from enmity to friendship. It says, good and evil are not equal. Repel evil with that which is good, so that the one with whom there is enmity becomes as if he is your closest and warmest friend. So let us go out from this parish, from this congregation, from this church, from this house of God, and spread the truth and make more friends so that we can be an army of foot soldiers to spread the truth for society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
God bless you.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you so much.